Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm your host Sana MAQBOOL with you at BTB World. In today's show, we will be taking a look at two very important stories concerning Pakistan. The first is with reference to our relationship with the United States, something that has been under the limelight in the recent past. There have been a lot of talk, of course, with regards to the previous government and the previous Prime Minister with reference to a conspiracy that was also foreign-led, in which, of course, the United States was also pointed out despite denials by the US government. However, we now see that there has been a renewed commitment from both Pakistan and the US side to re-establish these ties and to take them forward and enforce a relationship that has been there historically, and something which of course is very important to both the countries as well. In this regard, it is very important to understand what is going to be the new direction that Pakistan is going to take to rebuild this relationship moving forward, and then what areas are going to be the focus of our relationship with the United States. Earlier, we know that Hina Rabbani Khar has pointed out that the focus would be mainly on economic ties and trade relations. And then we also know that there is a visit by Mr. Bilawal Bhutto Zardari to the US, where he will be engaging on various fronts with the US. He's also going to be meeting the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, in a one-on-one meeting. And that, of course, is going to point towards the direction in which the USS Pakistan is going to take. We've also been issued a State Department's statement which talks about how the US also assures its commitment to rebuilding Pakistan's economy and contributing its support towards establishing relationships with Pakistan. There are going to be other important aspects of this visit as well, which we're going to explore further in our first segment. In our next segment, we will be taking a look at what is going on within the country in terms of the water crisis and climate change impact that is affecting various regions in Pakistan, especially the most high temperature affected areas within our country. There has also been a drought alert that has been issued by the Met Department. And we also know that there is a task force that has been made on climate change, which is being led by Sherry Rahman, who talked about how there needs to be perhaps a more consolidated approach towards what we need to do in terms of mitigating these effects, and then of course in terms of water conservation and to deal with the challenges that we face currently with reference to these changes in the water crisis. And this of course means that there needs to be a lot done on this front, and whether or not we're going to be able to cope with the situation that we are heading towards is of course the point of conversation at the moment when we look at what needs to be done and how we can react to these challenges. So that is going to be our focus for the second segment of the show today. As always, I've been joined in the studio by Farrukh, Pitafi and Raja Faisal. And for our first segment and the next, we're going to be joined by Mr. Saeed Muhammad Ali, who's also a foreign affairs expert. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Ali, and being a part of the debate. We'll start with our first segment and talk about our relationship with the US. It seems that in the recent past, the relationship between Pakistan and the US has been strained with reference to the political dynamics that existed. But then we also have many reassuring statements from the US side, which seems that perhaps the impact of that is not going to be seen in terms of how we evolve and take this relationship forward, which also points with reference to the engagement that has already started and the foreign minister's meeting with the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, as well. How do you see this particular visit, and then the challenge that Pakistan holds in terms of re-establishing a relationship with the US, which is not only functional in terms of economic relationship and trade, but also more in the strategic sense, where Pakistan and the US collaborate on a larger front, and Pakistan is able to establish its position because of its ties with the US? Mr. Ali?
Yes. Oh, sorry, I wasn't sure that this question was for me. So I think that we are, Pakistan's at a very sort of tenuous, in a very tenuous situation. If we look in our neighborhood at Sri Lanka and the sort of fast, the meltdown, that economic meltdown that Sri Lanka has experienced, there is a danger that Pakistan might be heading in this direction. On top of that, I mean, with our bilateral relationship with the US, which has experienced a lot of turbulence, I mean, during the past 2 decades, but even in the way that the US has exited Afghanistan and the current situation there, that hasn't gained us many friends in the US, and the increasingly sort of acrimonious statements perceived by the US coming out of Pakistan over the past few years have further strained that relationship. So given this situation, given how the former government ended its tenure, given the current political instability, these are all sort of background factors that are going to influence interactions with the US. And I think the US also realizes that, there are some issues that are of American interest in the region, and Afghanistan and stabilization and counterterrorism is one kind of, one core interest. The other is the sort of the nuclear interest and the fear of catastrophic conflict in the region. But at the same time, ironically, the US and how it's engaging with India and trying to prop that up vis-a-vis China is creating more stress within the region. So that's another set of factors. And thirdly,
right, Dr. Ali,
is this,
Dr. Ali,
yeah.
I'm glad that you're talking about the whole range of relationships between the two countries. But there is something very interesting that while you were mentioning various aspects, I was thinking that nowhere it has mentioned in the Western media that Pakistan is a thriving country of 210 million people, and a lot is going on in this country. Where do you think we are lacking in that, and do you think that Bilawal Bhutto somehow can compensate that? Because at this moment I understand India might be lobbying against you, Pakistan-US relations might be difficult, but both countries have done a lot for each other, and Pakistani people's beauty should also be visible to our American friends.
Well, Mr. Pitafi, I mean, unfortunately, in realpolitik, I mean, yes, there are, rhetorical statements, but from this kind of realpolitik angle, right? I mean, so besides the sort of the niceness and the diplomatic language, I feel that these are two underpinning factors, but I agree with you that, I mean, even within the US, there is this realization that, look, this is a nuclear armed country. This is a country of, 200 million, 220 million people, but economically, I mean, we have not been playing our cards right. And I mean, a lot of that blame, can also go to how the global political economy is structured, right? I mean, now there's a lot of talk in the US about sort of China and China's sort of predatory lending. But let's look at the history of American lending to Pakistan and, and IMF and World Bank lending. I mean, what kind of sustainable growth has that helped Pakistan achieve? Yet, the importance of Pakistan is, I think, is acknowledged, right? But there is, but there are these sort of divergent interests, and the third divergent interest is China, right? And how Pakistan is interacting with China. Pakistan wants to walk that fine line, right? But Pakistan is not the determining factor here, in this great game. So, these are the three factors around which the conversations need to happen now. Yeah. At least in DC, the reading was that when Foreign Minister Bilawal and Anthony Blinken had that telephone conversation, during which he's been invited to the Food Security Summit as well, there was a sense that they were, in terms of expectations, talking past each other. Because Foreign Minister Bilawal was talking about, a reset of the bilateral relationship, whereas Anthony Blinken had a laser-focused, approach of putting again to the forefront, a very sort of modest and American-centric, exactly. List of demands for Pakistan.
Dr. Ali,
yes.
Earlier you mentioned about obviously cooperation. That America can extend, and America's focus could be on terrorism. Of course, we know that in past the terrorism that originated from within Afghanistan, it affected the whole world. And right now there is another threat, that is of ISIS Khorasan, or nowadays it is termed as Islamic State of Khorasan Province, ISKP. Which is being considered as the backyard of, or the training ground of Daesh right now. And of course, it is a direct threat to the Western world, especially Americans. Looking at these facts, could we say that Pakistan can play a role of a bridge between Taliban and Americans, especially knowing the fact that ISKP is a threat to Taliban as well. Taliban's regime is under threat by ISKP. So could we say that it will be discussed there as well?
Sana, before Dr. Ali actually responds to this, I just wanted to, with your permission, actually highlight one aspect, and I call it unbearable lightness of being. Pakistani intellectuals like my brother here keep on talking about other countries. I mean, Afghanistan is important. We know all about this. But with due respect, why is it that we hardly ever talk about Pakistanis when it comes to relations, bilateral relations with other countries?
Right.
Only for the one reason.
As well.
Only for the one reason that if Afghanistan is stable enough, of course, it would be a good factor that can play a good role.
And of
in
course, then we can
stability.
then we can also talk about Pakistan being stable. But Dr. Ali, go ahead.
I absolutely think that Islamic State is a common denominator. So because if we look across the region, the South Asian region, for Pakistan, for Afghanistan itself, for India, for China, right, and other neighboring states. I mean, even Iran, and for the U.S. In different ways, Islamic State becomes a concern now. Islamic State has, there are possibilities of convergence with Islamic State, and when it comes to Pakistan and Tehrik-e-Taliban. Right, even ETIM, the Eastern Turkmenistan Islamic Movement, right, in the recent attacks that we've been seeing in Pakistan on Chinese investments, there are also potential convergences there between TTP, Islamic State, and ETIM. And similarly, the other states mentioned. But the problem is that, while this is a common denominator, and while this is actually, the Islamic State is now morphed and trying to contend and woo sort of disgruntled elements from within the Taliban. And in a way, it's constraining the Taliban's ability now that they are in politics to be political, right, to be diplomatic. So I think the Taliban, the way in which they are digging in their heels, right, like walking back on promises, vis-a-vis women's rights and sort of, this kind of culture of this impunity, it is trying to avoid attrition. It's trying to avoid, their people, disgruntled elements going and joining Islamic State. So while it is in everyone's interest, right, there are other groups on which these different states do not agree, and I think that is preventing them from cooperating, from everyone from cooperating. But
right,
of
Mr.
course,
Ali, another aspect which affects our relationship with the US, of course, and which was also something that was pointed out again and again, is of course our relationship with Russia, and our stance perhaps on the Ukrainian conflict as well. Even this meeting on the food security, the stance that the US has had is with reference to the conflict that has of course affected food security. What would be Pakistan's position in this regard, and then in general as well with reference to Russia? How are we to proceed or go about this delicate balance? Because at the end of the day, that issue still remains, whether or not we talk about however it was politically manipulated. But at the moment, when we look at our relationship with the US and our relationship with Russia or other countries, if we want to be able to go ahead and engage with countries worldwide, then we'll have to go through this tricky balance. Are we prepared to do that?
Well, historically, we haven't been, and I think our neighbor has. Right. I mean, if we, this idea, while we toyed with this idea of non-alignment, Pakistan, put all its eggs in the Sito-Cento basket, felt disappointed, right? I mean, post-Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, we again sort of, followed a myopic path, and I mean that came and haunted us post 9/11 also. We've had this kind of cooperating on one side and perhaps not cooperating on the other side with the US, but not only with Russia but also with China, because with China we already have a very significant relationship. With Russia, it was aspirational. I think India has done a much better job, right? Like preserving its ties with Russia, doing the business, the security business, because it realizes that's a very long-standing relationship, and they have been able to convince the U.S. right that they want to simultaneously build both relationships. But I think Pakistan kind of jumped the gun in trying to hedge its bets, and it did so at a time which was wrong. Right, so the optics of our premier going to Russia and then being taken to lay a wreath on the tomb of the unknown soldier. Yes, that was a World War II memorial, but doing so while Russia is invading Ukraine, created distaste in the rest of the world. So I mean, of course, one is not saying that America is Pakistan's true friend or any other country, I mean, in real politics, that is not how global politics and international relations operate. They operate on mutual interest. But the way in which we need to diversify and walk that fine line, I think needs more nuance, needs more thinking, and we need more practice.
Yeah, Dr. Ali, as a student of political science, we've been obviously reading about former Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. He was someone who introduced independent foreign policy, and in his tenure, of course, we saw that Pakistan was following the independent foreign policy at that time. Looking at Bilawal Bhutto, are we seeing him following the same tracks towards the independent foreign policy of Pakistan?
I mean, this is interesting. I mean, just before, you said this, I was kind of thinking about this to myself, and people have drawn parallels to how ZAB was talking about anti-imperialism and how Imran Khan has been talking about imperialism. But of course, then within the PPP and then what happened, with ZAB and then with Benazir Bhutto, she managed to build much stronger ties with the West. And, Foreign Minister Bilawal Bhutto is, I mean, he's got, he's got a good team with him, right? And I think even within the US, there is this desire, and they saw some relief that, that the establishment within Pakistan did not frame this as a Western conspiracy. Yet that does not mean that the relationship is going to get the kind of boost that Pakistan might desire. I think America is still being quite cautious, and they note that the economic desperation in Pakistan is dire, and the political uncertainty.
Right, and Mr. Ali, the US has also welcomed Pakistan's deliberations with the IMF, and perhaps such an announcement may have a positive impact. But could there be any more support that we can expect from the US? They talk about their support towards rebuilding Pakistan's economy, and of course we're looking for negotiations with the IMF as well with regards to our package. Could there be any real support from the US side?
Well, as a development anthropologist by training, I mean, we could have a long discussion about the IMF, but I'll pause on that. Look, one thing that, clearly there's a lot of potential for is trade, right? I mean, already for Pakistan, our largest export market to this day remains the US. Now, in an ideal world where nations were really helping each other, in the past, during the Obama years, there was a discussion of having a reconstruction opportunity zone straddling the Durand line. And the idea was that Pakistan and Afghanistan will work together and they will jointly produce products that will be given special access to American markets, and a win-win for everyone. It'll help lessen tensions between the Afghan government at the time and Pakistan. It'll ease the problem of the Durand line, right? And it'll be an incentive, for in a sustainable way for both these countries to prosper. But that did not take in the US, and there was internal opposition, right? I mean, sort of the textile manufacturing farms here, but there are ideas of trying to reactivate something like a ROZ even now for long-term sustain, because Afghanistan cannot survive on humanitarian aid alone. And
Right,
Pakistan,
we're almost out
even
of time for
with
this
CPEC
segment, Faisal, so I'll just take a last comment from you, Farrukh, and then we'll continue our discussion with
Just
the
a
next
last
one.
Right, interestingly, while I was listening to you, Sana, and then of course Faisal and Dr. Ali as well, I was wondering about certain cliches in our foreign policy. For example, I've never understood this term called independent foreign policy. Independent of what? I mean, come on, you're talking about a country's foreign policy. Foreign policy is supposed to be geared by the domestic concerns and interests, right? So I would actually go for another word called wholesome foreign policy, where you make as many friends as possible and you don't lose a friend at the cost of another, right? And this is one thing that is very important. Secondly, then I heard this word conspiracy, and then suddenly Bhutto Sahab also suddenly came in the discussion, and I was thinking about the former Prime Minister who keeps on bringing up this point. One amazing thing about Pakistan's politics is total washing their hands of own agency. I mean, we keep on accusing other people of perpetrating these conspiracies when we know who did it. I mean, for example, when you talk about Bhutto Sahab and his phansi or his hanging, I keep on thinking that there was a gentleman called Tara Masi who actually hanged him. And then there was a court order that actually led to that. And then there was a dictator who first actually allowed him or tried to allow him to, some political space. But initially he came out and he started talking against the very same man. And then the dictator thought that if he is going to live, I'm probably going to die. And then he hanged him, right? This is what kept on happening. But suddenly we realized that Henry Kissinger, perhaps it was proven, perhaps it was not, but he made a general comment, and we start actually building these castles in the air that there was a conspiracy. Similarly, now as well, repeatedly this is happening. We know all the agents who were there, right? The people who kept on bringing the change. And then finally, the amount of denial in that relationship. I sit here with confidence, I can say as a student of history, that both the US and Pakistan have done a lot for each other. You know, when you talk about China-Pakistan relationship, there is no denying. When you talk about India and Russia relationship, there is no denying. But whenever it comes to Pakistan-America, people forget that without Pakistan, the Cold War could not end.
Right.
And without Pakistan, the war on terror could not actually succeed. Right. Similarly, when you talk about the US, when Pakistan first signed the defense agreement with the US, do you know what was happening? At that time, your army, total size of your army was 250,000, and actual number was somewhere around 80,000. And now look at the size of it, right? Similarly, the economy. There are so many things that have gone on. For example, Pakistan's 2 major dams, they were actually possible because of the US support.
Right.
So at this moment, we have to actually remind both sides that these countries are essential for each other, and not because of any third country like India or Afghanistan, but because of the people of Pakistan who are influential, who are actually now successful in the world. The US FTC is headed by a Pakistani American woman, right? So we are important people, and I think we should be engaging in that way.
Absolutely, and it's very reassuring, the statements that have been coming in from the US side as well. Yes, Faisal.
Yeah, just the one-liner. At right now, whatever our priority should be is that we should be expecting from US that out of this visit, they are in a position to influence obviously institutions like IMF, and Pakistan obviously desperately needs an IMF bailout. So I think Pakistan should be expecting from US that they can help out Pakistan in terms of influencing the institution like IMF to give us a bailout.
Well, we certainly hope so, but let's see what happens. Let's also talk about the issue with regards to, of course, the water scarcity and the issue of climate change and what we're facing in most regions in Pakistan, a drought-like situation. In this regard, of course, it is also encouraging that perhaps that we can actually talk about these issues with regards to this meeting on food security and talk about how all of these actions need to be taken in a more proactive way. Then, of course, that would also be very helpful. But again, we've seen that there have been a lot of global action action, perhaps in terms of what needs to be done with reference to climate change and what measures countries need to take. However, they have been slow in the kind of response that is required. Perhaps the urgency of the matter is not taken seriously, despite the fact that we have seen a lot of such incidents in various parts of the world and not just in Pakistan. But action is still, of course, awaited. And Pakistan, unfortunately, is also one of the high-risk countries of climate change. And we've seen a lot of issues with regards to our conditions in different areas of Pakistan. And now, of course, we're also dealing with issues of water scarcity. We're going to talk about all of these issues in our second segment. I've been joined online by Mr. Amar Guerrero, who's an environmental journalist. And I hope I said your name right, sir. Thank you very much for joining us in the debate. When we talk about the issue of climate change and water scarcity within our country, there, of course, are many numbers and stats that we see which point towards the urgency of action that is required, which points towards how dire the situation is. However, it seems that not just within our own country, but internationally, perhaps people have not been taking these issues very seriously, or they don't understand the kind of impact that it's going to have. Do you think that the kind of prevalence of the talks with regards to climate change or action that is needed to deal with these issues is being talked enough around the world, is being highlighted? Because, of course, we need people to take action. But is that sort of the movement that is required for these actions to be taken? Does that exist worldwide?
Thank you. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Actually, maybe in the other parts of the world they are taking it seriously, but if you would talk about Pakistan, most of the people, masses, are not aware even of the extreme weather events which are happening due to as a result of the climate change in Pakistan. So, and at government level, even it's not being what to do to cope with this situation. Like if you just see to the entire Pakistan, that in northern areas, there are the glacial lake outbursts that are in KP, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, you will see there are the flash floods and the shrinking of the agricultural land. In Punjab, same is happening in southern Punjab. In Sindh, if you will see, that are the eastern part along the Indian border, there is the Thar Desert and the White Desert and Nara Desert. And in Sindh, along the Balochistan border, there is a Kacho and Kohistan. These all are the arid region, and they are going through the worst, severe, frequent droughts for past 10 years, 12, 15 years. So the situation is already bad there. In Karachi, in Pakistan's biggest city and commercial hub, we are witnessing the heat waves for past 7, 6 years, and it's happening almost every year. Not only this, but there is also a sea level rise. So same is happening in the Balochistan, where from the Makran coast, masses are migrating with their animals and with their livestock in search of the fodder and water for the animals. So it's happening around all over the Pakistan. But it's very sorry to see that at government level, nothing has been happening. Means we are the
Right,
victims.
and I'm glad that Amar, I'm glad that you're talking about government's performance and government's response. When I'm looking at the screen, I can see this banner up here, water crisis, right? It reminds me that when the current government, the current ruling party was in government last time, in 2018, perhaps in the last month of power, they actually introduced a water policy. And that water policy perhaps was never implemented because they were not there. The next government came, whatever it did with it. But regarding this water policy, I hope that you have read it. Do you think that this is some kind of model that we can implement in this country? Amar.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear your questions clearly. You are talking about what policy, or I don't.
Water policy that the PMLN actually gave when it was in power in the last month in 2018.
I think if you see that we have a very, very bad model for the water usage, we are. It's generally said that Pakistan is a water scarce country, and we are going through the water scarcity, but it's not true. We have a lot of the water, but we are using it in a wrong way. still in this 21st century, we are using as a flood irrigation. Means when there is a modern irrigation methods like hydroponic and the vertical farming and other things, but still we are just filling up all our fields. And, we are consuming a lot of more water consuming crops like the sugarcane, the rice, cotton. So these are, and we are means bulk producing this and exporting this. That's very sorry. Means why should we export these products? To produce those crops, we produce the fertilizer by using 70% of our natural gas to produce the fertilizer. Then we are importing the hybrid seeds, pesticide, insecticide, and then 75% of our workforce is in
Right,
agriculture.
Mr. Amar, I
But
understand
despite
what you're
that,
saying, and I understand the kind of impact that is there, and of course, the kind of measures that are required perhaps are not being taken or haven't been taken in the past. We have an entire ministry that is dealing with climate change, and now the Prime Minister has also established a task force. What sort of strategies do you think that this task force needs to implement on an urgent basis? Because, of course, this is something that we're dealing with currently, something which is very immediate and needs to happen now so that we can mitigate those effects. What do we need to do at this moment to take this forward?
I'm really sorry to see that we are just restricted to climate change, but at the same time, our government was going to mitigation, not to the adaptation. Like right now, Jacob is international in the headlines. Jacob is going through the worst heat. So they need immediately the water, the cooling places, the heat stroke centers. They need some electricity, some water, shades, and other things. But these things are not being provided at the ground there.
All right. I'll take this question back to Mr. Ali as well. With reference to the Prime Minister's task force and the entire ministry that's dealing with climate change, do you think that overall we have made significant contributions or taken significant steps with regards to mitigating the effects of climate change and dealing with issues of water scarcity? The reports have been out there for a while now of the kind of situation Pakistan is dealing with and will be dealing with by perhaps 2025. Do you think that the action that was needed has been taken and the direction perhaps that this task force or this ministry is going to take forward will be helpful?
Well, let me say this, that, Mr. Amir Garia, who's on the ground, would have a greater sense of what's happening there. I mean, I had noticed, in the recent past, programs like Recharge Pakistan, which was an interesting proposal besides the billion tree tsunami, right? And one doesn't know exactly how that's gone on the ground because I haven't followed that on the ground myself. But, the Recharge Pakistan program was supposed to be a good one because it was trying to go back to recharge the aquifers, because for the past several decades, in areas where there isn't irrigation, I mean, the whole irrigation system, and the use of this hydraulic economy has its own problems, right? And this emphasis on damming, and thinking that is the best way to go also creates complications. Seawater intrusion, right? Like changing the natural flow of water and then using tube wells, So, I mean, anyone who had the ability to buy diesel or use electricity, they could pump out as much water as they wanted from the ground. The water wastage that had taken place. So the idea of Recharge Pakistan was that they were going to try and let the water seep back into the earth, right? I mean, so there was still, this diminishing groundwater situation could be rectified. Again, I mean, I don't know how that's going on the ground, but I can, I think and perhaps that can be the next question where I can talk about sort of this Pakistan being the environmental hotspot, but trans-border, the complications that this is creating for trans-border water management, for instance, which has a lot of, I mean, there are tensions within the country as well, right? I mean, interprovincially, but there are also major implications with the Himalayan glacial melt on the Indus Basin Water Treaty as well.
Right. Can we, since you also brought up, Dr. Ali, this interprovincial water dispute or water issue, can we talk about the lower riparian, like Sindh, which seems to be in a tough spot because it thinks that it is not getting the kind of water that was needed. And perhaps it is also time to, revisit the water sharing accord as well, because that seems to be a big concern right now.
Right. I mean, water is this thing, Pitafi Sahab, if you start from the bottom up, right? I mean, if you look at the household level, who gets the burden of fetching water, right? Whether it's him standing outside a tap in an urban slum or it's walking increasingly to go and fetch water. So, first of all, it's the poor household who geographically are located in areas where there's water scarcity and there's they are not getting water out of their taps. And similarly in agriculture, if you look at water courses, the poorer the farmer, the nearer the tail end of the water course their land is, right? And it's the rich farmers who and it's the flat irrigation rates, and the rich farmers have been able to use a lot of water, and by the time it is supposed to go to the tail end, poorer farmers don't get it. So there's this issue of poverty. Then within the poor household, it's women and girls who face the brunt. And then if you take it to the provincial level, there are these accusations of provincial hegemony, right? So the most populous province taking the lion's share of the water, and that creating disgruntlement with the other provinces. It doesn't mean that the irrigation departments in the other provinces are super efficient, because even there, ones with the political power and affluence will get access to that water. And then if you take it to the trans-border level, that is another level.
Exactly.
With the
Exactly.
Indus Basin Water Treaty and its implications.
Mr. Amar, we always hear that if we talk about the Western world, of course, they have the technology and they are using it, and they turn the rainwater, they convert that into a drinking water, plus they have the technology to convert the used water into drinking water. Just wanted to know, a country like Pakistan, which is one of the 23 countries that are going to be most affected by the climate change, and we are seeing it, that it is taking place, and we of course know that our rainwater, it gets wasted. We are a country that constantly, every 10 years or 5 years, we see some kind of floods in our country as well, and that too goes to the seas, and the water is wasted. Don't you think that Pakistan, as an underdeveloped country, needs help from the developed countries in terms of technology, in terms of investment in the water sector, especially to overcome this scarcity, owing to the fact that we can use the rainwaters for our population, but of course we are lacking the tech to do that.
And Amar Sahab, if you remember a few years ago, actually there was talk of desalination plants as well, particularly on the pattern of Israel, which actually purifies its ocean water and uses for the domestic consumption. Do you think that we have a chance regarding that kind of a pattern also?
Listen, one thing that Pakistani media is always making any propaganda, it's comparing the countries like Dubai, UAE, which is actually a desert. They don't have any water source, so they have no option to means other than desalinating the seawater. But in Pakistan, we have a lot of water. According to the 91 Accord, in river Indus system, there is 114 million acres feet of water. That is, we are wasting into the agriculture. Only 3% of this water we are consuming for the human drinking. If we can just make it 3% into the 7%, and if we will, for example, the river Indus system is going between the in 100. So whatever the water, river Indus water,
Right.
I don't we have a
Chairman,
problem. We can shift
We're
the same
facing-
question to Dr. Ali, if that's possible.
So we don't need desalination or the rainwater harvesting. We need two means to utilize this. We must not waste this water into the agriculture. Why should we produce rice or that we cannot even store? We produce wheat that we cannot preserve, and which is going wasted every year. 70% of the wheat that we produce every year, it goes wasted because we don't have a storage capacity. So why we should talk about the rainwater harvesting and desalination? It's like, just save the water is coming out of the air conditioner.
No,
It's
Amar
not.
Sahib, that
It's
is
the
a
basically
good
water
point.
into the rice,
Amar Sahib,
cotton,
that is a good
sugar.
point, but just to qualify what Faisal is saying, I mean, we are talking right now about populated provinces like Punjab and Sindh. Balochistan, my province actually, lacks water resources, and then a lot of people actually have to drink rainwater, and that becomes really horrible when it comes to the way it is stored. So perhaps technology can solve that problem as well. I think we can take this question to Dr. Ali as well. Dr. Ali, do you want to actually respond to it?
And I just wanted to add to that, should we be seeking help from obviously the developed countries that owing to the fact that the whole world is being affected by the climate change, we being the underdeveloped countries or developing country, we should be helped by the developed world.
Right. So again, I think the elephant in the room is agriculture. I do agree because, I mean, agriculture is taking up well over 95% of the water. Look at what we grow. Cotton, sugarcane, highly, water-intensive crops, and we waste a lot of water. But of course, there are regions, if you look at Umarkot and other places where there's actually, you need things like, at the household level, quick, easy solution, rainwater. I'm not a fan of desalination because, desalination, you do when you don't have water, which we do, we just don't use it right. And desalination is very expensive. So I think for a country like Pakistan, desalination it might be a nice, shiny project on which we can spend a lot of money, but probably will not make a lot of sense. Now, when it comes
Dr. Ali,
to,
sorry to cut you, but just to understand what you're saying, this matter of things being not cost effective, actually capital intensive, is it not true that whenever you introduce a technology, it is usually cost prohibitive, but then the economy scales and things start coming down, the prices start coming down?
They do for things like solar panels, but if you look around the world where desalination already exists in the Middle Eastern countries, they have their own oil, it's still very expensive. So the cost of operation of desalination has not come down yet. At least at that mega scale. However, when it comes to other forms of technology as well, I think we need to, and again, putting on my development anthropologist hat, I think that we need to be careful because whenever you have technology, you also have elite capture, right? And it takes a long time for that percolation to reach down to the people most in need. And sometimes that technological innovation can create problems for poorer farmers. Think back to the Green Revolution and the introduction of mechanization and chemical intensive farming, which created ecological problems and created a lot of depeasantization. That's when you had a lot of Haris moving into the urban slums, right? So we have to be careful when we look at things like drip irrigation and who's going to be using that technology, who's going to be able to afford to use that technology. And secondly,
very quickly, I just wanted to actually add one thing here, Sana, with your permission, regarding Balochistan. If you travel there, there are places where perhaps water is going to be more scarce than gold. Why? Because they use this technology called Kares that actually brings water up from the water table, and which is continuously declining.
Right.
And then you don't have any other methods. What it will do is depopulate the area. Instead of that, you'll have to come up with out-of-box solutions. Balochistan is 44% of Pakistan, half of Pakistan land-wise. So you cannot abandon that, right? You'll have to use technology.
Absolutely. And earlier we were talking about water wastage as well, and this is something that we've been looking at throughout, and there have been campaigns run, and we've all been taught in school how to save water. But at the end of the day, it is commendable for someone to have that sort of moral accountability. But shouldn't we also aim more towards perhaps accountability in terms of limiting household consumptions, or limiting consumption to the kind of usage that we have, or the number of family members? I mean, isn't there some way that if this resource is so important, that we can actually quantify it or quantify its usage and limit people with regards to whatever it is that they need in terms of the demand, and then target those households or those areas where we can actually curtail that? Because even in the federal capital, we've seen that a lot of issues are now being raised with reference to groundwater levels decreasing further, with almost every household using far more than they need. Yes, Mr. Amar.
There is no need to be water to be saved at household level, like we are propagating them while we are brushing our teeth. We should not open the faucet. So that's not actually the thing. Water consumption for human beings in Pakistan is not more than 2% of the total available water. From this water, if we just stop producing rice and we import the rice from outside, we have 30% water instead that we can divert into the canals and send it to the Gwadar, to Quetta, to Third Desert. In Pakistan, 32% bed occupancy in the hospital is because of the contaminated water. Then we can save that money and we can put into these canals, and we can available to the water to the all people. There is no need to go into the salination. There was a salination plant in Karachi. It was inaugurated by Faisal Musharraf, but it ran only for 3 days. In Third Desert, there were 700 reverse osmosis plants, 700. They could run only for 6 months. They are no more in the use. Whenever there is technology, they need continuous repair and maintenance. That is not possible in Pakistan. We have
all right, thank you very much, Mr. Amar Guerrero, for joining us, and Mr. Ali for being a part of the debate and talking to us with reference to both our relationship with the US and then, of course, the very important issue of water scarcity in the country. And at the end of the day, it is up to us how we are going to be able to deal with this crisis, and how much we are going to feel the responsibility that we must in order to conserve this resource and be able to save the large number of population and areas that are being affected by this change. So at the end of the day, we really hope that we're able to do something about it sooner rather than later, so that we can mitigate the effect of climate change and water scarcity in the days and years to come. Thank you very much for watching the debate.